Okay, good afternoon. Hello, welcome back, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Another wonderful day at the church. We are so grateful to be in the community with you. Any newcomers? Anybody here for the first time? Oh, wow, quite a number. What? I'm going to try not to make that controversial, neighbor. My name is Sherry Pescarella. I'm the executive director here at the church, and I would like to extend a very warm welcome to all of you being here on a beautiful Sunday afternoon where we will be exploring the topic of preservation and architecture. This afternoon, first of all, I actually need to let you know that Matilde Guidelli from DIA Center is sadly sick and was unable to make it out this morning. Paul will be presenting her slides in her place, and we have some information to share on her behalf. I would like to acknowledge that the genesis of today's conversation, it was in the true spirit of community collaboration. I had been in separate dialogues with Tara Kuby from Preservation Long Island, as well as Nancy Achenbach and Zach Studenroth from the Sag Harbor Historical Museum, about the interest in doing a conversation on architecture, specifically historic architecture of the East End. And in dialogue together, along with Lee Skolnick, we arrived at today's topic, which is preservation as a creative act. So I would like to, first of all, we would like to also thank Preservation Long Island, from whom the church received an award this year for our preservation efforts. So thank you so much. And I would like to thank the Sag Harbor Historical Museum, which has made some wonderful efforts in preserving the history of artifacts and culture in Sag Harbor and moving forward with that history towards a present and fulfilling future of this great village. So with that said, I would like to introduce you to Nancy Achenbach and Zach Studenroth from the Sag Harbor Historical Museum. Say a couple of words.
I'm delighted to have you all here. This has been, as you well know, history, and we deal with old houses, but one of the wonderful parts is that the transformation of this incredible building, which is, and the other buildings that we will hear about. But that's part of our history. It's a newer part of our history, but it will certainly be our history going forward.
Amen. Well, one thing that many people don't realize is that when the then Historical Society was formed in 1985, its mission was to kind of get under the skin of, perhaps, or behind the village fathers to promote historic preservation throughout the village. One of our early founders was Nancy Willey, who was a great advocate of historic preservation and one of the moving forces behind the historic district in 1973. So although we are now a historical museum, and you may think of that as being a collecting institution that sponsors lectures and exhibitions and things of that nature, and publications, which is true, our real mission is to work with the village to push the agenda of historic preservation whenever we feel it may be not getting as much attention as it should. So I'm really delighted to work with our wonderful new director, Nancy Achenbach. So that's our purpose in life.
I would like to introduce Tara Kuby from Preservation Long Island, and we're so delighted to have you both here, and Elizabeth Abrams.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Tara Kuby. I'm the Preservation Director at Preservation Long Island. Our headquarters are in Cold Spring Harbor, but we have 3 other historic properties, one of which is the Custom House just around the corner from here. And so we really see ourselves as a partner around all of Long Island, but specifically in the neighborhoods where we have our historic properties, including Sag Harbor. Well, advocacy work for us often focuses on specific projects and goals around Long Island. We also strive to be leaders in the field representing Long Island's significance, not just regionally, but nationally. And so we do this through academic writing, publications, and then also in doing talks like the one we're having today. I think that it's so important that we are constantly addressing questions like, why is preservation important? Who is it for? And what should it look like? And one of the best ways to do that is to include people that have different and unique views than the ones that you necessarily typically see in the field. And so that's part of what we see today with the panelists here. It's my great pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Paul Bentel. Paul has been a great partner for Preservation Long Island for a very long time. He serves on my committee and until recently was my committee chair. He's a partner at Bentel and Bentel Architects. He's also a professor at the Columbia University Historic Preservation Program and is just a noted expert in the field, and I can't think of anybody better to moderate this discussion today. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me? Good. Okay. See if this. Okay. When Sherry asked me for a photograph that would be an introduction to my participation as a moderator, I put this image in without really thinking about it. But in retrospect, thinking about the question that we're going to be addressing today, some of the topics, one of the central topic is going to be values. What is it that we actually value in a historic property, and how is that carried through a design project? We're going to be looking primarily at adaptive reuse. What is the relationship between what we perceive in the past as having been important, and how does that translate into something as we move forward? This is the Andrew Geller House, the Double Diamond House. It was recently renovated beautifully, and there's an addition, actually an annex, which was sensitively placed behind the building. Clearly, as an image of preservation, it calls to mind values that are related to a casual beach culture from the 50s and 60s. But from my point of view, the building was built in 1959, so it's 2 years younger than I am, and I have to say, any effort to keep it looking young is something I'm enthusiastically behind. Before we begin, I'd like to say a few words to put the presentations today into context and to frame our discussion. The first arises from thinking about the title of the conference, Preservation as a Creative Act. Some might be tempted to ask, can preservation be the domain for creativity? After all, from the public perspective, it's a highly regulated field in which experts opine on the best way to transfer heritage, that is to say buildings, landscapes, neighborhoods, but also increasingly other kinds of heritage that are intangible. But how do we transfer those things that we get from the past to the future as if those objects were completely untouched during the time they spent with us? But nothing lasts forever. Even preservationists balk at the idea that anything can be wholly preserved. There will always be change, and with change comes both loss and renewal. As the sponsors of the event themselves assert, every effort at preservation requires hard thinking about what we value most. In the process of recognizing value, we're compelled to prioritize those things that we think are important. We act on those determinations. As a result, we create value, which is now ascribed to the things we preserve. We transmit those values, now manifested in the things we have preserved, to the future. And in this important respect, preservation is inherently a creative act. And what we're going to see today are projects, two recently completed and one which was completed almost 40 years ago, which are each preservation projects in the sense that they are transformations of pre-existing buildings with certain historical associations and local meanings. And they all demonstrate ways in which that transitioning from the past to the present to the future can be orchestrated, and with what outcome. The second point I'd like to make also comes from a reflection on the title of this conference. What exactly does the act of preserving something offer us as a domain for creativity? For those who think about working with things we regard as heritage, the value of those things exists on a spectrum. On the one side of this spectrum is the actual form of that heritage. For buildings, that might mean their material, their construction method, their style, features that we associate with the object. Guided by this value, the domain of our creativity is delineated by our ability to work creatively with those features. At the other end of the spectrum lies the meaning of the object to the individuals or communities to whom it has value. Guided by this value, our creativity operates in the domain of ideas, emotions, personal and social identities which the object manifests. I call this a spectrum because for some, one type of value may be more important than the other. Some preservationists focus on the form of heritage. Others concentrate on the meaning that heritage bears to an individual or a community. However, the poles of this spectrum cannot be exclusively considered when we preserve something. They are reciprocal. The physical aspects of a heritage artifact are intimately bound up in its meaning to those for whom it has value, and the meaning of the object to that community impacts the way in which we understand the object that we act upon. So as we consider these examples of preservation and creativity, I'd like us to keep in mind this idea of heritage value. How do the projects we are about to see reveal the physical acts of creativity evident in tangible ways? And what do those physical changes reveal to us about the individual and social values before, during, and after the work is done? So now we're going to briefly introduce some examples, 3 in particular, of preservation as a creative act. And I think we'll start with Jess. Jess Frost is the founder and executive director of the Arts Center at Duck Creek. Jess spent summers as a child in a cottage across the street from Duck Creek, when it was owned by the abstract expressionist John Little and served as a meeting place for artists in what was then a burgeoning artist colony. Destiny guided her return. Many years later, as executive director of the Arts Center, before returning to the East End, Jess trained as an artist and worked in New York City. She was later appointed associate curator of the permanent collection of Guildhall. As a founder and now executive director of the Arts Center at Duck Creek, she's helped to create this vibrant cultural venue, which, based on the testimonials alone, is as much about the remarkable programming as it is about the character of the place she helped to fashion and create. She'll be discussing the work associated with the adaptive reuse of the barn, formerly the studio of John Little. So Jess, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. Are you going to direct that, or shall I?
You can.
Thank you. Hi, and thank you. Well, I want to say thanks to Preservation Long Island for all the work they do, and thanks to David and to Lee and to the church for bringing this conference together. It's a really important aspect of my life. I actually grew up in a small village. I spent my childhood in a small village called Roslyn in Nassau County. And my father was an architect who specialized in historic preservation. So I watched him grapple with restoring an entire village throughout my childhood. So this is something that really resonates with me. And I didn't even realize till I was neck deep in Duck Creek, the association. Anyway, this is the Gardner Barn at Duck Creek Farm. It was basically Duck Creek was one of the first working farms on the East End. It ran from over 199 shoreline acres with 2 other farms out in Springs. Was owned by the Edwards family, and they had a farmhouse, which you can't see here, on the property. We don't actually manage the farmhouse. It hasn't been restored yet for reuse, but this is a barn that was purchased by the artist John Little in 1948 to be used as his studio. This is a photograph of the barn being raised after being taken down in East Hampton Village and moved to Duck Creek in Springs.
Since then, a large window's been put on the side of the barn, and it's been used as his studio, was used as his studio from 1949 until he passed in the mid-'80s. The image on the right is of John Little in his studio. There aren't a lot of photographs of him working in the studio, but obviously you can see it's a very crowded and fruitful space. So the images on the left are photographs that I took of the barn in the late 90s, early 2000s. The space had been, I would say in the 90s, the Little's daughter had lived there. They passed away in the 80s. She lived there for another 10 years. And the property was purchased by Helmut Lang, who actually wanted to make some changes to the buildings and the property itself, and the town refused to let him do that because it's landmarked. So he sold the property to the town, who purchased it with CPF funds. CPF is the Community Preservation Funds. It's basically a property tax that people pay when they purchase land on the East End. It's 2% of whatever you're paying for your property, and it goes towards historic preservation and the preservation of green space. Most of that is green space. The town is trying to ensure that the area stays green, and sort of thwarts excessive building. But in some cases, there are buildings on these properties, and Duck Creek had this beautiful barn, as well as a farmhouse that was built in the late early 1800s, again, that hasn't been restored yet. This is a early 19th century barn. So the space was, as you can see, pretty rough when we first started doing kind of pop-up shows there. We did a couple of sculpture exhibitions on the property and inside the barn, which proved very frustrating for the fire department, because clearly there are no exit signs, there's no emergency fire doors, anything like that in the barn. So they shut us down fairly quickly, and the town proceeded to restore the building. And over the course of a year and a half, after having done these little pop-up shows there, we navigated a license on this property through the town of East Hampton. We got our 501c3 and rather aggressively pursued this license. I won't get into the nitty-gritty of that. It was pretty complicated. What it comes down to is there are a lot of limitations on our license because of CPF rules. CPF protects a property that it purchases through restrictions on retail activity, exclusive use, and residential activity. So no one using a CPF property should be, according to East Hampton Town rules, should be doing any sales. They should not be renting the property for events. They cannot receive funds through exclusive activities. Everything that we do at Duck Creek has to be for the public, has to be free to the public at all times, with the exception of one benefit a year, which I'm hoping to push them to change. Needless to say, what you see there in front of the barn is kind of one of the few impacts that we've had on the space. We were doing concerts. We would have to lay plywood down. We were basically not allowed to make any permanent changes to the structures. So this was another, like, a pretty hard thing to navigate with the town. That structure is not attached to the barn. That's how we got around that. We don't actually have, I forget what it's called, but we don't have a permit. We haven't closed the building permit on that stage because it is temporary and it is meant to be removed at some point. This is just sort of the ridiculousness that we deal with the town of East Hampton. But they did allow us to put this stage up, which really helped us, sort of elevate our concerts, literally and figuratively. What you see on the left is an exhibition of paintings by John Little, the artist who lived in the house in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. Those are paintings that were actually created and then stored in the barn up until beyond when Helmut Lang owned it. They were moved out in the 90s when the property was sold to him. And then on the right, you can see in the photograph that the barn remains more or less the way it might have been in the 50s, with the exception of the fact that John Little had built an apartment on the left side. You can see the windows that have been boarded up, different color wood, which again, we've decided to leave as they are instead of staining them, because the idea being that, you know, you're really reflecting on the history of the building. You're leaving traces of the activities that happened there. So that was an apartment that he would rent to other artists in the summers when he lived there, including Franz Klein and other, you know, well-known artists that stayed with him in the summertime. On the right side, you can see a juxtaposition of this studded wall versus the sheetrocked wall. We have not done any kind of sheetrocking to the historic barn. The images on the right are of a garage that was not landmarked. So it was a, you know, probably mid-70s garage that was built, preserved, restored to look historic by the town in keeping with the rest of the property. So we were actually able to sheetrock that space and give the artists sort of a more flexible space to hang their work. And then here you can see on the left the concerts from the interior of the barn and then also from the exterior of the barn. I don't want to take up too much time, which I tend to do. So I'm going to leave it at that, and I'll go on more here.
Okay. I'm going to talk about Dia. If you could just give me the. Okay. I'm going to do my best to pretend I'm Matilda. So I think most people know the Dia in this room are familiar with the Dia Bridgehampton, which was originally a firehouse that was built in 1908 and continued to serve as a firehouse. And interestingly, the tower, which is where they used to dry the hoses, served very well as a civic symbol when the building was sold to a African-American congregation and became the First Baptist Church in 1923, which it served as until 1979 when Dan Flavin with Dia undertook to restore the building and also in the process create a home for the Dan Flavin Foundation, as well as a permanent exhibit of his neon artwork. The building, as it was transformed over the years, changed somewhat. When it became a church, it was added to on the front. You can see on the right-hand side the image of an extension, essentially. Minor changes were made in the way that you entered the building. You now entered from the side. There was an addition added for a small apartment. And as a consequence, the building grew in aggregate form, like many buildings naturally at that time would grow. On the interior, it remained a very simple structure. Here you see the transition from firehouse to church to what we see today. And I think you'll note that there's very little on the exterior that was actually changed, except for a very subtle but really important part, which is the painted finish on the lower level. For those of you, I mean, I think everybody's probably familiar with Flavin sculpture. This is the interior of the sanctuary, which now houses the Flavin sculpture, and here they are. So he created a series with, I think Richard Gluckman was the architect for the renovation, a series of angled walls to insert his fluorescent artwork in a three-dimensional relationship with the space behind it. So it's a very interesting situation for his artwork, which reflects forward and also backward. But in addition to that, I think a very interesting relationship exists between these walls that have been introduced to the very simple interior of the building itself. And I think this is something we might want to talk about a little bit, the role of these spaces as backgrounds for art, because this is quite a different kind of installation and quite a different character of interior space than, for example, at Duck Creek. There are elements of the original building that remain as testament to what was there previously. The congregation moved to another location. Those are minor. the primary inspiration, I think, for the building as it currently exists was largely to provide this permanent home for artwork. So Lee, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Am I good? Yes. Wow, that's volumetric. So I'm here to talk about preservation as a creative act. And the reason that I suggested that title was that as an architect, people say, well, you know, you do buildings, you know, why would you want to do a preservation project? And the truth of it is that every project has tremendous creative potential. And, you know, from my point of view, it shouldn't be limited to preservationists. Anyone who is interested in creating space for communities, to deliver meaning and stories, history, where we came from, where we're going, should be just as interested in the creative potential of a preservation project as doing a new building somewhere. And I'm not going to go through the history of this building. I've given a number of talks here and tours, and if you haven't been on one, I'll be happy to do one for you. I want to talk about the process a little bit. So, shall I advance? Yeah. Okay. Let's see if I advance. Nope. So I really see that the church as a case study in this kind of thesis about preservation. And yes, as with the other projects that you've seen, the church had a very long history, both up the hill from this location and after moving down here in the 1860s. It had a steeple which, like many of the steeples on the East End, blew off in a hurricane. And when we encountered it, it was partially eviscerated. I will tell you a little bit of the story, that there were 3 or 4 iterations of renovation, adaptive reuse that were proposed for this building. They included a workshop for a decorative arts artist. They included a crazy idea for a over-the-top residence with a lap pool going all the way through the center of the space. But all those were abandoned, basically for financial reasons. And I remember, and you can correct me, Eric or April, I think at one point they were trying to sell us for like $23 million, right? And nobody bought it. And thankfully it stayed on the market until these 2 visionaries, Eric Fischel and April Gornick. What's that? Well, no, I was about to let you off the hook. And they got it for a bargain, which didn't seem like a bargain at the time, but it was, as I said, it was partially demolished inside. And this is where the creative part starts, because they had a very clear vision, not of what was going to happen in here, but what they wanted it to represent for the community. And so the creative part was, I often say, the success of this project is we didn't do anything more than we absolutely had to do. And there are 2 reasons for that. One is flexibility. You know, when you're doing adaptive reuse, you want the building, the structure, to function in as many possible ways as it can. There's also the issue of budget. You don't want to spend any more money than you have to. But the third one, which is really important, is you want to enhance the communication of the existing building, its integrity, and not pervert that. You don't want to tell a story that is inauthentic. And so, you know, the approach that we took, and these are just some, actually you can see, we happen to be in the space, which is amazing. There were carvings from the carpenters who worked on the space, which if we didn't know the history, we certainly know it now. 1864, 1899, 1868. This church had a life, before it became this ruin. So we decided to open up the space so that it would be as flexible as you see it, as it is now.
Question,
Yeah.
which is, my understanding was that the space was largely unfinished when you started working here.
Yeah, there were, it looked like that. So there were, it was mostly open. Some things like that stairway still remained. Some interior framing remained. You can see the frame and panel on the balustrade on the bottom right. So there were some things, and we looked very hard together at, again, what is the least amount we can do to make this relevant for today.
I think this is something we want to pick up also because Jess, in your presentation, you said you did very little on the interior of the building, I gather. Is that correct?
Yeah, Duck Creek had nothing to do with the actual design or restoration. We kind of presented an opportunity for the town to see what it could be, and I thank goodness that they did as minimal work to the building as they could, and also did a really accurate historic preservation because it had been used as an artist studio. So I mean, fittingly, it would be appropriate for us to use it to hang work, but it really, they did the bare minimum.
So Lee, did you have limitations also on the what was removed or replaced on the interior?
No, there were no, the building is not landmarked, it's not, has no designation. The exterior was restored as closely as possible to the way it existed previously, without the old steeple, which had been gone for a long time. But the interior, as we spend time in here, one side story is, this happened, a lot of it during the pandemic. And I had the privilege, really, I was out here because we moved out for the pandemic, and so I was able to come here every day and see what was going on. This is like the master builders of Gothic cathedrals. They were on the site every day. Today, you do drawings and you hope that they built it the way you designed it. Well, here, we were solving problems on a daily basis. We'd come in and say, wow, look at that framing. We've got to keep that exposed. How can we do that in a way that will, in the end, create a coherent and a cohesive experience in space?
I just want to follow up on that point, because one of the great virtues of working with a pre-existing building is that you have the opportunity to actually witness it before you engage with it. And so qualities of light, materiality, for example, are things you can actually see.
Well, we always say that one of our very, very large priorities in my practice is that we listen. We listen, we listen, we listen before we do anything. Usually we're listening to the site, and we're listening, of course, to the clients. Here we were listening to the building. The building was telling us, don't do that. Or make sure that you preserve this. We wanted to get to the essence, the authentic essence of the building, and then create a dialogue with it. So this is what architects love to show these things. This is an exploded X on a metric. You can impress your friends. So what we did is we looked at every element that constituted the structure and decided what role would that element play in the conversation that we would have between the past and the present. And so we mostly wanted to expose and celebrate the framing, the timber framing of the building. We exposed no one would ever have seen that. There was a plaster ceiling, but it's beautiful, it's breathtaking. And so we insulated the roof on the outside so we could expose it. The framing of the walls is this beautiful geometric composition, and so we knew that we wanted to make that manifest. But I remember April and I looking at so many different paint colors to say, let's find the balance between it holding together as an entity, but at the same time expressing the integrity, the power of the timber frame. So all of these little nuances were critically important. And when we talk about creativity, that's where the creativity was. We didn't create this building. We responded to this building. This was actually, well, it's behind that wall. You know, all of the plaster walls were installed over wood lath, which is this thin wood strips. And so we had, excuse me, a shitload of it, although in the end I think we had to get a little extra. But we decided to reuse it in a way that was not its original intention, but would pay homage to another aspect of the building's heritage. Oh, I love this. So when you take a little tour around here, you see that slide on the right. We wanted to make a clear distinction between what was old and original and what was new. And so we sort of conceived of the interior as something floating within the shell. So anytime that a modern element like this mezzanine or the stairs was about to hit the wall, we stopped. And we either put in metal
Grates.
Thank you, grates, or glass, so that we could keep a respectful distance between the modern and the
You know, this, Jess, you were speaking about the stage element, for example, as something that could be removed. Had it, Lee, you're talking about a very important point, which is where do you draw the line? And if the line is obscured, are you detracting from what might have been there previously?
we were ruthless.
You were ruthless.
I mean, we said that we are going to make sure that any time two elements,
Came together,
there would be a reveal.
Yeah, this is a very, one of the things I think is very important to understand about engaging in this kind of enterprise is you establish for yourself a set of guardrails, basically, in order, either by some regulatory body or voluntarily, but you have a kind of responsibility or sense of responsibility to the original.
I mean, we basically made a formula where anything that was new was going to be blonde wood, this white oak, sheetrock, or metal, painted gray. Now, why bother doing all this? Does everyone who come in here realize that? They may not explicitly realize it, but they still get it. They still experience it. And that care that you try and exercise creates a quality that, that's getting back to this thesis of preservation as a creative act. That's the creativity. That's what, as an artist, as an architect, you try and express something in the clearest way possible and through the least amount of extra baggage.
I should point out that even in the Flavin Institute, the walls that were inserted on the upper level rose to a certain point but didn't intersect with the ceiling. So there was always a sense of separation there. And so even 40 years ago, it appears that there was a keen awareness to this idea that there's something wonderful about maintaining that line that separates one thing from the other.
I mean, this was certainly a creative response. Eric had this idea that, since we were replacing the windows with these 20-foot high windows, which, you'll see in a second the special detail we developed for it, but they would have been stained glass windows. So we talked about, well, we don't have the original stained glass windows, and we're not going to do traditional stained glass windows, but it would be nice to take that idea of the windows expressing something about the place and about the values and about the purpose.
So another interesting point. You look for opportunities where they exist to articulate something in the existing building. Jess, you mentioned you hadn't done anything on the interior, but at the same time, the signs of its prior use are still there, and they become, and you point them out, and they become part of the narrative of the space.
Yeah, and in fact, one of the hardest things that we grapple with at Duck Creek, it being an exhibition space, is actually mounting the artworks to the wall without damaging the historic building. And we're right now in the process, 8 years in, to figuring out how to create a sort of sister set of studs that we can actually adhere the buildings to. And then the question is, do you stain them so they look like the old studs? Do you leave them as the fresh wood? Do you hide the change? Do you call attention to the change? We actually had Maziar Beiruz working with us to try and come up with more creative solutions that my board was not thrilled with. I was a little more interested in seeing some more sort of responsive elements, but we basically, I think what we're going to move forward with is just sistering every stud in the building, and we'll see where we go with in terms of how much attention we're going to call to that. But the idea behind that being that yes, we left the blonde wood, the fresh wood in the windows, and it's one of the things I think that is most important to me. Responding to the use, I remember talking to Eric about the fact that he wanted this organization and this art center to grow organically. So we really took our time with Duck Creek to see what the community needed from us before we went in and tried to create something. And exactly as you're saying, you're creating rules and you're leaving space for growth and for reflection. For us, it's really every proposal, all of our exhibitions, or most of them, are proposal-based. I'm looking for artists who are looking at this building and they are looking at the challenge of hanging a show in this building in an inspired way. You know, we're not looking for people who, when we first opened up, people were saying, well, I can hang a sheet of burlap or canvas and hang on top of that. Thank you, no, we'll not take that proposal. So, and it's exciting. It's exciting to see people rise to the challenge. I imagine this is a challenging space to hang exhibitions in, and I've seen, you know, the full gamut of what this space can do, or at least so far. I'm sure there's probably more to happen, but it's really exciting to see people rise to that challenge and really work with the building itself. It also gives us an opportunity to talk about the history of the property and farming on the East End, and you know, and the artists respond to those things too. We welcome that dialogue always.
Well, for any architects, I don't know if there are any in the audience, but I highly recommend having artists as your clients, because they are used to the creative process and they get as much satisfaction and excitement out of it as I do. And so, you know, being able to do that together is really, really a gift. And when you have people who are sensitive to these issues, it just is so much richer, and turns out. So I was about to tell you about these portraits. You know, I could have designed stained glass for this building. Thank God I didn't. Eric had this great idea to sort of venerate artists, writers, musicians, dancers who did their work, at least some of their career, here in Sag Harbor. So there's a lot of meaning in this. It's not just decorative, it's not just architectural.
So Lee, this raises another question. This is a building, as is Duck Creek, that is embedded in the community. I mean, it's not only a community center, but it's also a place that's been around for a long time. People recognize it. Does that raise the bar with respect to the identity of the building or the outcome of the building?
Well, we had a lot of discussions. Eric was always talking about this sort of trinity. We have, Bay Street over on Long Wharf. We have the cinema, and we have the church, and they form this kind of triumvirate which cuts right through the middle of the village. And we were very aware that that was our goal, to create a real anchor for creativity and in all its forms, in all the disciplines. So if we had thought that this was just going to be a gallery, we might have done it differently. If we thought it was just going to be a performance space, we might have done it differently. If we thought it was only going to be a research and study space, we would have done it differently. But we've managed to find that balance where any of those things can happen.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
If I may.
Yeah.
It's similarly for Duck Creek, our guardrails and our sort of rules and the character was the CPF guidelines, was accessibility, was, like basically making sure that the entire community is engaged as much as possible. So the building steers the building and the restrictions on the building have steered our basically our ethos. And that's, that's kind of what I feel like has inspired me, and actually I feel more like an advocate than a curator at this point, because I feel like we're really focused. We're using that barn and those rules to make sure that we're doing right by the people that live in our neighborhood and beyond. So
I was on your website, and I noticed that you include testimonials from your community, from the artists, for example. And there were a couple of really interesting ones. Julian Schnabel writes, in the welcoming rustic barn and landscape of Duck Creek Farm. So he's recognizing this rusticity, this old. A light has been switched on that says, join this community of joy and talent and newness and be surprised to see what you wouldn't have seen otherwise. And I think it's a remarkable testament to not only a building and a place, but a building that has some time associated with it. And he speaks, or actually there was Jean Silverthorne spoke specifically about the joy of hanging artwork in a room that has heavy timbers, which I also thought was really touching. She said, this was my first experience showing in a formerly rural architecture, a barn, and I was fascinated by how the elements of the architecture changed the way my work looked. For sculptors especially, the exhibition space affects which pieces you will show and how you will show them, but it is rare that one feels the architecture to be on an equal rather than competitive or disappointing footprint with the art.
there was an image that I had put up earlier where you see the garage space, which is not historic, with the studs and then sheetrocked. And we needed to do that sheetrocking. The town required us to. It was not permissible to have public gathering there with exposed nails and those sorts of things. So we had to sheetrock the space, and it made it more flexible. But if you were to scroll back to that image, you can see a painting looks very different on a timber wall than it does on sheetrock. And I think a lot of people are nervous about hanging. I mean, there is almost a domestic element to doing that. But I think some of the paintings, a lot of the artwork that we put on these walls really sing in that environment. And it makes you realize how suffocating a white cube can be, for an artist, for a curator.
And I think this is, we have the Dia Bridgehampton, which is on the opposite side of the spectrum, but also certainly legitimate as a direction for exhibiting artwork. And so this is, I think, a great example of you take opportunities when they arise, when you're dealing with these kinds of structures.
Well, and that gets back to this issue of creativity as well, because, design is essentially creative problem solving. I mean, you wind up having things presented to you that need to be figured out. And if you can figure them out in a way that creates a new form of a traditional kind of idea, then that's creative problem solving. This little glass strip, which you'll see up in the mezzanine, allowed us to have, you see the windows, the 20-foot tall windows in their entirety, not being interrupted by the solid floor. So, you know, we looked at 3 or 4 different ways of doing that, and ultimately the glass was, you know, the most successful.
When reviewing the Dan Flavin project, if I could just borrow the clicker for just a second, I was really struck. So Flavin works with color and light. The building that he decided to work with was shingle style, very rough and textured, which is precisely the kind of materiality you don't want if you're trying to take advantage of a background that gives you the best opportunity to create light. The one aspect of this building that was changed significantly is the white paint on the first floor on the exterior, specifically so that it would serve as the background for the light. Very simple modification, but it has huge impact on the way we perceive the building and the way we perceive the building in relationship to Flavin's work. And I think that's the kind of sensitive response, and the glass that you just mentioned, that really distinguishes this kind of work, because you take, again, opportunities where they present themselves. So Jess, I want to ask you, who decided to paint the doors on the barn white?
The town did.
Because I've seen so many testimonials where I love the white doors.
Right, yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly why that decision was made. I think actually the doors that are there now are probably more in keeping with historic age of the barn than the ones that John Little installed, possibly. Maybe I'm
just
giving
find
the town more credit.
I look at the picture in the lower right-hand corner and I say, that's a proscenium arch. That is not simply a set of barn doors.
And what existed, what the town had actually put there was a ramp that had slats on it that were, I suppose, again, historic for horses or what have you to walk in and out of the barn, but it was a safety hazard that we got to call attention to and allowed us to leverage them to let us build that stage. But again, you know, anything that we do to that barn has to be taken down. It has to be removable. So it's, but the fact of the matter is, all these things kind of are another layer of identity. And I think had the Flavin not been painted on that ground floor, it might disappear a little bit, or you might not acknowledge it as just like an Alice Aycock on your lawn is going to signify to people that is going to signify to people that the purpose of this building has changed.
Well, there are certain places where you really do have to take a stand, as you said, Lee. One of the features of this building that I'm particularly struck by is the removal of the lathing on the wall and the reuse of that as a decorative element elsewhere. Were there other places where the kinds of activity that you engaged in required removal, reinsertion, elimination, addition that were things you struggled with? I mean, for example, I'm looking at the elevator.
Yeah, we struggled with the elevator. And as you can see, it's right at the place where the pulpit would be in a sanctuary. And we weren't making a comment about that, but it was just the right place to put it. But certainly making a glass elevator was a conscious decision so that it would, exist lightly in the space. You could see through it. Those end windows face west, and so we get this afternoon sun streaming in. And actually, I'll show you something. One of the revelations. We'll just scroll quickly through this. I wanted to show you the incredible variety of events and installations that happen here. And I think Sherry will attest to the fact that they all work. I love these installations that interact with the building. So they're doing exactly what we did, but on the next level. And this sculptural piece is just brilliant the way it threaded through this. This is spectacular. And you can see how the building and the art are working hand in hand. They're in a dialogue. So just as we were in a dialogue between the past and the present, these artists have taken that to the next level, and they're in a dialogue with what we created.
These were artworks that were, these are site-specific artworks?
Yeah, well, those are, yeah. Those are the stairs on the right. That stairway was covered with that pattern.
Well, this is also a very interesting thing, the idea that these buildings become structures that support individual areas of interpretation. And are artists, Jess, are artists actually creating specifically for the space that you have at Duck Creek?
Yeah, we've had a few site-specific exhibitions, but often the exhibition is adapted to the site. For example, we had a wonderful artist named Elizabeth Duffy who was deconstructing rag rugs and sewing the materials that these rag rugs were made of back together, and then creating sculptures and clothing out of them. And she basically showed up with her installation materials, one of which was a wire coat rack and a rug that was meant to go on the floor. And you know, I, as the director and the curator, I removed all, contemporary materials, and we figured out how to hang the clothes without the rack within the studs. We mounted the rug onto the windows. I mean, the site-specific works maybe have, I don't want to say have less to do with the building and more to do with how the artist adapts to the building. Mm-hmm. But that was one show in particular that I felt really talked to the agrarian nature of the building, the history, the dialogue that she was having with the materials and the work that she was making, and how we had appropriated and changed the use of the barn. But yeah, I'm racking my brain right now for a site-specific show, and I know that there's one, but I can't remember it at the moment. I'll think about that. But yeah, I mean, even the sculpture that actually we have an artist here Wendy Klemperer, who did an exhibition there in the front row, who did an exhibition.
Oh my goodness, Wendy, how are you? Long time no see.
I mean, with
I
her,
was just out there. Are those your pieces out at Duck Creek?
No, a few years ago.
yeah.
Good.
She has a beautiful show up at the Vanderbilt Museum, and yeah. But she, like those were not site-specific works, but we took a lot of time to think about where they would go in the property and the scale of them in relationship to the property. There's a lot that we say no to. I mean, it's part of the excitement of, again, making Duck Creek accessible through a proposal program instead of curating shows and selecting what we want to show. We're giving the community an opportunity to participate, and then also selecting those shows based on how they will respond to and interact with the barn. And also, I mean, for example, Julian Schnabel showed up for an exhibition that was done by someone that he knew and decided that he needed to do a show in that space, that space spoke to him in a way that, and who was I to say no? And it was an incredibly gratifying experience. In fact, that would be a perfect example. He brought his own crew. I would not use my crew this way, but he has his own insurance. And they went into the rafters. They were, putting paintings. They were exercising, experimentation in a way that I might not have. I mean, I fancy myself someone who does take risks, but he was, able to really stretch the space in a way that had not been done before. So that was exciting too.
So Lee, do you find that having introduced so much that is new and interesting and really rich, that inspires other people who come into the space and use it, are also thinking about doing something that engages so vigorously as Julian Schnabel?
Well, the artists who did some of those works and many others have, stopped me and said, it was so inspiring, it was so exciting to work with this space, because we're all used to white galleries, and that's great for hanging a painting, but you want the space to come alive. You want it to be an organic kind of a being, and by giving people just enough to then riff off of is, I think, the way to go. I mean, that again, I keep going back to the theme. That's the part of the creative part. It's not imposing yourself. It's knowing just what the balance is between your expression and the life that this is going to take on. Mm-hmm. And I mean, one of the wonderful things, I'm using a mic, but even when you don't use a mic, the acoustics in here are fantastic. And music, which is performed here, just has this incredible resonance because it's an open space. So of course that means that it's fairly live in the sense that when I speak, and given the speed of sound, it bounces off that wall and comes back to me, which means that there's a certain reverberation which makes things live. That could be very distracting if it weren't for all the wood, which actually softens it. So you get this wonderful combination of space that has some excitement orally, and at the same time, which is resonant, like a musical instrument. And those are things that I didn't come in here thinking about that. I discovered it. And then once we discovered it, we made sure that we didn't destroy it. Mm-hmm. And I love hearing music in here. I mean, I came in here during construction with my guitar and just sat here and played. And it was like a concert hall. And it wasn't even an electric guitar.
Yeah, we have the same experience with Duck Creek. We didn't intend to have a music program specifically, but a friend of mine who happened to be a music critic for the New York Times was like, you can't not take advantage of this space. And in fact, before we had the stage, the musicians stood inside the barn, and the barn actually functioned as a speaker, amplified. One thing that I wanted to call attention to is that really amazing installation that Christine Schuley did in the rafters of this space. She was actually one of the first shows that we did at Duck Creek, which actually is what got us shut down. She had done a light installation. They hadn't restored the building yet, and she blacked out all the windows, filled the barn with all this tulle, and had projectors. And so people were walking into a pitch black barn with exposed nails, no exit signs. That's when the fire department showed up and said, get out of here and don't ever come back. But it was like, again, the fact that we managed to just get, I think it was only 2 or 3 shows up. Actually, the parish did a show with someone there before we started activating it. But 2 or 3 shows before they saw the value of this. And, again, I'm now on this town property management committee that deals with CPF properties, mainly that have buildings on them, and trying to think of what's appropriate for these various spaces. And we can't all have just art. Part of the problem that I had when we first decided to move forward with Duck Creek was I didn't want to be redundant, and I didn't want to steal anyone else's energy. But we had this rule where we couldn't charge for anything, and that was our niche, and that was the audience that we went after. We weren't interested in, no offense, and I don't mean to sound like a communist, but we weren't interested in the moneyed weekenders. We were interested in the people that lived down the block that maybe didn't feel like they had access to this kind of activity or this kind of culture. So but yeah, Christine Schuley's to blame for everything.
Paul, do you want to take one more question to Lee and Jess before we open it up to the audience?
Sure. There is a solidarity amongst people who get involved in adaptive reuse. It's almost like a Alcoholics Anonymous kind of thing, because you've all got problems you have to deal with. One of the things that I think I'm hearing, however, is that the materiality of these spaces is something that's really important and becomes a reference through whatever it is that you do there. You can't ignore the materiality of these structures. And what do I mean by that? I mean, the Flavin structure is basically white sheetrock inside, but that's purposeful. And he responded to that. Here we're talking about exposed timbers, for example, and the patterning on the walls and the marks that you see. Those are the things that become present. So
Well, that's what we had here. We might have been, we've done museums inside armories.
yeah,
I mean, you respond to whatever the characteristics are. Materiality may be one of them. Volume is another. When you talk about adaptive reuse or historic preservation / adaptive reuse, remember that many of the hotels, museums, religious spaces that you've seen and love, many of them were something else first. The Louvre was a palace. The Hagia Sophia went through many iterations of Christian and Muslim, ritual. That's, to me, actually, when we were doing the church, this was all about artists in residence. And we created a volume in the back which had a little living room and a few bedrooms and bathrooms. And it turned out that the organization, as it grew, needed staff space. We didn't have any staff space. So you wound up converting those into offices and finding other places for the residents. There's the lower level, which is, I love, the lower level with the stone. It's like 20 inches thick of stone. That was just going to be workspace, studio space for the artists. I've seen every kind of event possible down there, and it works. And I think that's the thing to bring to, as you say, it's the materiality, but it's everything about the structure. I said, before, you have to listen.
yeah. Thank you. Well, I think we'd like to take some questions from the audience, if there are any.
Oh, well, how could I ignore these hands?
Thank you all. That was really elucidating and generously presented. And it's great to have other organizations. We always love having other organizations here with us at the church. I just want to say that to both, you were all making points about the involvement of people who are going to run a place and the vision and whatnot, but I wanted to just give a big shout out to the people that worked with us on building the church. We inherited Lettieri from the people that were going to make a McMansion out of it, but we switched to another building company, Moises Cerdas, a guy whom Eric and I had known for a long time, which is a lot less expensive. But the reason I bring this up is because they were really inventively involved in this place. They had to do with like the glass that Lee was explaining lets you see the full windows. They helped. They made models. They really, the guy who did the sheetrock in between all of these wood slats, like absolutely nailed it, like made sure that it fit in just perfectly. So it felt like this wonderful community collaboration almost from the first.
It was like a building workshop.
Yeah, and it was so beautiful to see the care that everybody was taking. So it's like our collaboration, but I just wanted to do a big shout out to them because I don't think this place would have the integrity that it does without the way that they executed the work and some of the things that they actually gave to the project and were creative.
Yes, absolutely.
Creatively involved.
Question?
Go,
Thank
yeah,
you.
do that.
Well, I first just want to say how lucky we are in this community to have all these great cultural institutions and spaces and places. I mean, we're so lucky. But I've been in this space so many times, and it looks different so many times. And it seems to me that sometimes there's movable walls. Am I making that up? And where do you store those movable walls?
Well, you can.
No, I was going to hand you the mic.
They are, I have to stand away from that. They are actually not movable walls. It's a temporary wall system that makes use of the architectural infrastructure that's here. And so it's sort of like a hinging system that connects with some of the existing details so that walls can be easily, if you look on the back of this panel, for example, it's like a bracketing system. So it's very similar to hanging something on a cleat, and therefore you can use the existing infrastructure to put something not terribly obtrusively. It's essentially on the surface of the, working with like the rail that's up there, for example. So you don't have to go into the wood. We can preserve the wood and preserve the finishes and architecture that's there. So these are essentially attachments. Where I say they're not movable is that the system is not entirely reusable. So actually one of the things that we're working towards now in terms of now that as we're stewards of this incredible project and building, is over the next year developing like an RFP where the system will be completely modular and reusable. Because these panels are wonderful. They were designed, I believe, by the church's original facilities director, Tom Brokish. And they're wonderfully useful, but they are not reusable. So, and you see them throughout the church. And actually, one of the things, they've been in this iteration for a while, but you will see our show that opens in March 22nd. Some of these windows opened up there and those covered on there. And then this summer, you will see all of the temporary walls that you've gotten accustomed to seeing that are blocking some of the windows, all of them will be removed. So what happens after that is to be seen, but yes, it's a wonderful system of modularity. Sorry.
This is such a compelling topic, and I was struck by a few things more along the lines of observation. Maybe I can put a question mark at the end, but I was struck by this idea of what is preservation. One way that you could generalize about Duck Creek is that it's recreated a space that gives the feeling of originality in terms of how artists worked at a certain period of time in this long history of artists in the area, and the Barnes, the sort of non-refinement of spaces, et cetera, that were perfectly okay for painters and sculptors to use, et cetera, et cetera. So the way that you've established the programming for it moves into that preservation of an artist's energy, work energy, which is essential to the preservation of the bigger history of this place. The church was something that, the way I tell the story, there were three buyers prior to us. Each one had a vision of converting this into a personal use space for profit and personal gain. This building was originally a sacred space, and each of the people who tried to convert it to a non-sacred use were gently pushed out. And when we came in with the idea of a community art space, the building offered no resistance. nor did the town. The recognition that this is a space that's purpose was meant to gather people for higher purpose has been maintained. Obviously, it's not an orthodoxy, it's not a religion, but it is something that is an uplifting act because of creativity, etc. The one thing about this space that I love is that from the outside, more or less, it looks like a New England church. When you walk in the door, it does not prepare you for the experience of the interior. And the thing that you see most often is people move into a state of awe and wonder as they get quiet, that the space encourages a different relationship to something in here than they find outside. And that, I think, is an essential recognition of the nature of what preservation should aspire to. What is the context originally of each bit of architecture? How does it manifest itself? Is it something that's completely changing, or is it something that works with to reinvigorate its intended purpose? The other aspect that I want to say about preservation in terms of Sag Harbor, and Lee talked about it, with this idea of cultural anchors for the town. Sag Harbor, and forgive me everyone who's heard me spiel about this, but Sag Harbor was an industrial town. It always had a manufacturing aspect that built things that went out into global economies. It had a character about it because it knew that it participated in a much larger context than some of the agrarian and fishing communities, which were far more local in terms of its economy and experiences. So it also attracted a lot of people who were felt comfortable being left alone, people who were marginalized in other communities that didn't fit in, et cetera. Certainly there was a large creative community as well. I used to think, and this is going to preservation, I used to think that the arts community was parallel to the manufacturing. But I began to realize that, in fact, it isn't, that the arts is the next production economy of this town. And so, again, it's like, the act of preservation going towards the maintaining of the deep history of place is essential to how one lives and works within that place. There is no question, a mark attached to what I just said. And I apologize for that, because you guys are all talking great stuff, but it's so stimulating, and it is something that I believe so strongly in that I had to opine. So sorry about that.
I just wanted to add one thing. Again, within the testimonials for Duck Creek, there was Jean Silverthorne, who said that there's something remarkable about the space because it references a pre-industrial form of labor, which is what artists themselves do. And you got the feeling that the building was a cipher for a kind of solidarity among artists because it was speaking about the nature of their relationship one to another and to their medium as well. And I think when a building speaks in that way, especially, I think this is one of the secrets of historic structures or old buildings, when you work with them, they have the opportunity, the capacity to speak to people in ways that newer buildings don't, simply because perhaps they haven't had a chance to really be understood. But older buildings have been around, they have experience, and therefore people relate to them in different ways.
Before we go to a question, I want to represent a point of view of Matilde.
Yes.
Because One of the reasons why I had recommended this particular grouping of people and DIA, is that DIA has 12 international sites. Most of those sites are converted or architectural preservation. And the history of the buildings and their usage coincides with the development of a particular aesthetic of art that DIA generally advances. So with regards to how we are having this dialogue about how the space informs how artists are reacting, or if it's pre-existing work, how they use Duck Creek, and the same thing with the church, this is something that the DIA Foundation is exploring globally, and one of the challenges for their sites is how to also make them locally resonant. And I think that's one of the challenges for DIA Bridgehampton, is to find a way of connecting what its uses today with the local community. And I think that's one of the things that the church and Duck Creek have been able to respond to, thanks to the flexibility of the spaces. DIA, because there is this commitment to show the Flavin work on the upper level, the public gathering space is quite limited. And so it speaks to one of the challenges of preservation, but also speaks to the soul of the building and how those souls emanate and belong to space, and how we define community and how we define space and placemaking. Just wanted to represent Matilda. She's sorry she couldn't be here.
I just need to add to that DIA story, because I helped change the shows in the ground floor, and DIA is still, unfortunately, one of the best kept secrets in the Hamptons. Yeah. So you should go. The second floor has the Flavin installation, and it's wonderful, and it's permanent. But the ground floor has changing exhibits that change every year. It'll be up until Memorial Day, Sunday. And then it changes the artist. And so what we do is change the space according to the new artist's needs and the curators. And so there are 5 windows in there, which might all or some be covered. There might be something constructed to show the artwork, like right now is Liliana Porter, and we constructed these platforms to fit her artwork. Lighting, there was a Keith Saunier. The whole place was painted dark gray to highlight the fluorescent powders that he had, and the neon sculptures. So we have fluorescence upstairs, but fluorescence downstairs. So that was so it changes every time, and and it works with the building. There's very little of the actual downstairs space that is changed, except according to what they can do. So again, it fits with everything else, everything that you're talking about.
Chris.
Thank you.
Hi. I have what I hope is a short comment and a question. I wanted to pick up from what Eric said and connect it to what Paul said in the beginning about the idea of you're transmitting values as well as physical materials and an object from the past to the future. And when Eric commented that this building had sort of turned away people whose intentions were to use it for a personal or private purpose, it occurred to me that one of the things that was transmitted in this adaptive reuse was the value of community, and that the different approach to the windows also kind of transmits that value of Sag Harbor as a place where people come together from all different backgrounds to participate in something together. The question I had was just a short one, which is when Lee was showing the photographs of the church before the renovation was done, I noticed a very striking the original staircase, which was kind of a striking sculptural object in its way. And I was wondering, did you think about retaining that? Because it was kind of an interesting element in itself.
Well, we thought about retaining it. It was actually a double staircase. There were two staircases that flanked the sides of the base of the steeple. And I think there were a couple of things at play. One was it didn't really make sense from a circulation standpoint, and it was sort of overly grand for what we were contemplating, and it wasn't actually that welcoming. I mean, as Eric says, when you come through those doors, the staircase just draws you up, and we wanted to create that sort of an experience for people. You know, I mean, it would have worked somewhere, but it didn't work for us.
Other questions? Oh, okay. Hi. Mallory, can you help our friend here have a mic? Thank you.
I'm struck by the signatures on the building and the extent to which preserving an old building and taking it apart creates an opportunity to do the storytelling of the people who came before, and an opportunity to sort of seek out an inclusive question about everyone who was here, who participated in the community and in the building, and kind of blurs the line between the craft that you were describing of the collaboration with the builders of the building today. And I guess my question is, you know, what do you look for that reveals the stories of the past that the building can tell you about the people who've come before?
Well, you're always presented with different information. And, you know, as I said earlier, if you're really listening to this situation, then you find the elements that are, are meaningful to this structure, to this place in the community. When we do work in other buildings, as I said, it may be something else completely. But if it's almost like mindfulness. You know, if you're present and you really take the time to absorb, or we like to say we absorb, and we have this mantra in the office: listen, learn, distill, create. You don't start with a design idea. You start by listening, what you can learn from what you hear, then you start to synthesize that in the sort of a distillation process. And so in this case, you know, we discovered things. I mean, we discovered the bell that is now back in the belfry way after we started the project. We all wondered where the bell was, and then we wound up finding it at the back of the site in a crate. And, you know, it was a revelation. And that caused us to, you know, reinstall the bell, but also create a way to see it from the inside. Now, we didn't start with an idea like that. It's something that evolved over time. So just and then we decided to let you ring it yourself. So those are the kinds of things that happen, you know, over time, by continuing to kind of quietly delve into the essence of the situation. And that's what makes it, I mean, that's a perfect segue back to the, you know, that's where the creativity is. It's exciting. You know, part of the reason I wanted to do this today was to disabuse people of the idea that, well, preservation is, you know, things that, you know, nice older people, you know, drinking tea, think, let's preserve. But it's vital. It's who we are. And if we can create a dialogue between then and now, then we're doing our job to move culture forward and to continue to find those stories, those narratives.
Congratulations and thank you. I've enjoyed listening to how this building came to life, and I'm going to make a point of going to Duck Farm in the future. My name is Kate Ermilio, and many years ago we came to the village, fell in love with it, and bought an old house here. We found out later on that it is probably the oldest house in the village that wasn't, other homes had been moved here, but this one came with the first deeds from Southampton in 1761, and we own the Foster House on the corner of Howard and Main Street. The house was basically neglected for years, and everyone thought it was a tear down, but we bought it anyway with the understanding that we wanted to be stewards of original historic property here, and there were so many things because of the neglect that stood within the building. Everything is rounded because these people were boat builders, and the architecture has a roundness to it. So we probably have one of the most original homes here in Sag Harbor. We left it alone. And we did restore, we didn't renovate, but we did restore what we could. We were able to do that through, with permission from dumpster diving, because there were so many buildings that were being gutted in the village at the time. I was able to find 18th century doors, pieces of wood, all kinds of things to bring the house back to its original intent. My question is there any kind of a architectural graveyard that we could somehow come together when these buildings are gutted, that folks that do want to restore or reuse or repurpose could do, and that we could do a legacy, not landfill?
Yeah.
There are currently in a number of municipalities building codes that require the reuse of materials that have been removed from buildings. And it does, it raises a number of issues. Some materials that come out can be reused as raw materials. Some come out as artifacts of the past. But this is something that's become, we're on the cusp of that elsewhere in the United States. So hopefully
You do run the risk of Frankenstein.
Absolutely. That and also it opens up the question of what kind of license should we assume we have to simply remove a lot of stuff as well. So it's not just putting it back, it's also taking it out. So for many years, preservationists were very concerned about opening up that can of worms, but it's clear that this material has value and that it should be repurposed in some way.
I will say that a friend of mine who was a stepson of Francis Fleetwood, we in 2007, I think it was, really sat down and tried to map out how we could create it exists in Brooklyn, the materials are for sale, it's not a municipal situation. Unfortunately, real estate out here is just not available to house all that material, but we were coming up with databases and connections to contractors and architects, and I do think that if someone wanted to start a nonprofit, maybe that could indulge in that. I think it would be so wonderful to not see all that material end up, even the more contemporary material, end up in a landfill, because we have people out here that are struggling that shouldn't have to while things get discarded. So thank you for everything you said too, and for preserving that house.
Yeah.
We have a question, and then I'll end with April.
Just a quick question. The original historic landmark designation, to what extent did it have to do with Little's reputation? Was it a combination of things?
I think it had far less to do with John Little than the the property itself as a farm, as one of the original working farms, and especially the Edwards house, which has not been restored yet. It's basically sitting empty now. The town talks about restoring it, but it's that house was built in the late 1700s by the Edwards family, who farmed land there for a long time. So I think that was the first choice. And also, you know, I don't know if any of you know who Helmut Lang is. He's now an artist, but a fairly well-known photographer. And he, again, you know, I think that the town we have historic things are registered as historic, and that makes it really difficult for people to do what they want to with the property unless you have someone like this woman who decided to torture maybe herself trying to maintain the integrity of that house. But yeah, I think really they were trying to preserve the history of the farmland more so than John Little. We just attached ourselves to that. I almost wish it had been someone. There is actually a CPF property on the corner of Cedar Street and North Main Street in East Hampton that is called the East Hampton Historic Farm Museum. They're not as active as we are, but it's a beautiful old house, and they have a lot of more farm-related elements that they should be supported as well. If you want to say something?
Well, this brings me to a big thank you for your stewardship as executive director of Duck Creek. I mean, you've just brought it so far. It's fantastic.
It's a privilege.
And now I have to thank the stewardship provided by our amazing staff and Sherry and all the people that have come before. And I can't, you know, just talking about the bell, I'm so glad you brought that up, because there was this point, I remember it so well, like none of us was thinking about the bell at all. And for some reason, and this is what, maybe the building told people to say this to me, but people were going, and what are you doing with the bell? All of a sudden, nobody had mentioned it. Everybody was like, I'm so glad you're getting the church. But then all of a sudden it was like, where's the bell? What are you doing with the bell? When are you gonna put it up? And I was like, bell? Wait, where is it? I don't even know. And then you found it, and we found it. I don't know who found it. And then it was, again, it was like one of those community participation things where it was like the universe was sort of willing this. It felt like it was, you know, destined to happen. So that's a shout out to the community again.
There were lots of revelations. That was one of the, oh, I guess I didn't include it in here. Do you remember the first time we turned the lights on? It was late in the day, and we went outside and saw the place just glow like this warm golden light. I mean, it was, and when we found the transom, one piece of stained glass that we have over the front door, I was mentioning how the light comes in from the west, and it hit that transom, and it just exploded with color.
It's almost like we have a little mini Stonehenge moment where, in the fall around the equinox, there will be this like particular glow in that one little bit of stained glass that is left. And by the way, the Methodist Church had taken all the stained glass and shipped it upstate to sell, and we contacted them about the memorial panes of glass because it seemed like we could have put those back somewhere just to honor all those people, but they were like, oh no, it's gone. It's, you know, on its way to somebody's other building. But anyway, thank you guys so much. It's been an amazing talk.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you so much for your moderation. Thank you, Jess and Lee. Thank you to our partners, Tara and Preservation Long Island, to Nancy and Zach from Sag Harbor Historical Museum, and thank you all for being here. Have a great afternoon. Thank you.